Okay, since the U.S. And Israel launched their war of aggression a month ago today, in fact, against Iran, the conflict has engulfed virtually the entire region, and it threatens both to deepen and to spread further. I'll talk about that shortly, about some of the ways that it could spread even further. But just taking stock of where we're at, already thousands of Iranians, including school children and other civilians, have been killed by the U.S. And Israel. And of course, the top military and government officials have, or many of them have been assassinated by Israeli and U.S. bombardment. It's still largely, when we're talking about Iran, largely a war that's being conducted from the skies. I'll talk a bit about what's going on in Lebanon, which is a different story. The war in Iran has become a war of attrition between two nuclear armed powers on the one hand, of course the U.S. and Israel, and Iran on the other. And Iran we consider to be a neo-colonial regional power of some significance in the region. Of course, 90 million people. They have an industrial base, which doesn't compete with the U.S., but given the way things have shaped up, things are not going so well for the Israelis and the U.S. With their war efforts. I just want to state clearly that as revolutionaries, we have a side in this war. We are in favor of the military victory of Iran and the defeat of U.S. Israeli aggression, while giving no political support to the theocratic regime in Tehran. Some of the discussion that you've seen online and in other areas recently has portrayed the war as Israel's war, or Operation Epstein Fury, suggesting that there isn't really a U.S. interest in pursuing the war. I think that's a flawed analysis. We could talk about the role that the Israel lobby plays in U.S. politics and perhaps even the timing of this war, but to suggest that the U.S. doesn't have a material interest in attempting to overthrow the Iranian regime and secure the vast energy resources of the region, I think is mistaken. That's separate from the tactical ineptitude and mistakes that the U.S. has been making. But let's recall that the U.S. has engaged in several regime change operations in the region to install puppet governments over several decades, including, of course, the one that successfully overthrew Iran's Mohammad Mossadegh and replaced his government with the monarchist dictatorship of the Shah in 1953. And, of course, ever since the 1979 Islamic Revolution that toppled the Shah, Washington has wanted to reclaim this lost territory. The U.S. has backed Israel for more than 50 years, of course, providing it with billions of dollars annually in military aid, not to mention the massive boost since October 7th, 2023. The U.S. requires an aircraft carrier, as they've put it, in the region, and Israel has played that role for the U.S. In 1986, then Senator Joe Biden put it like this. He said, "Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interests in the region." And it's precisely to protect their interests that U.S. governments, both Democratic and Republican, have engaged in these regime change operations over the decades. Of course, we can talk about the Iraq War, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. The list goes on and on. As I mentioned at the outset, the Operation Epic Fury is not going well, despite the repeated declarations of victory by Donald Trump. Why is that the case? Well, Iran has used its inexpensive Shahed drones to pummel military and civilian energy and transportation targets in Israel, and U.S. Assets across the region. Apparently, most of the U.S. military bases that have been hit, and it's something like, I think 13, have been rendered inoperable. And many of the military personnel have had to relocate, including out of the region in some cases. Israel's so-called Iron Dome has turned out not to be made of iron after all, and Iran has successfully broken through and pummeled Israel with not simply those drones, but also ballistic and cruise missiles. Just a few days after the war began on Iran, Israel used the opportunity to launch yet another massive incursion into southern Lebanon, ostensibly to attack Hezbollah, which is of course aligned with Iran. This Israeli operation, has killed at least 1,000 people and displaced. I've seen different figures. I've seen at least 800,000. I've seen another figure, 1 million. It's significant either way. They're turning parts of southern Lebanon into a scene that is reminiscent of Gaza, of course, where Israel is still carrying out a genocide. What's Israel's objective in the region? It wants to neutralize its regional rival, Iran. Now, there are other motivations. There are far-right elements, religious fanatics of the Netanyahu government, such as Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and they seem motivated by this notion of creating a greater Israel, which will include at least southern Lebanon, depending on how you interpret greater Israel. It can include a significant chunk of the Mideast, including, by the way, many of the allies of the U.S. that are allowing Washington to use their territory to bombard Iran. Trump gave the green light for Israel to attack Iran's South Pars gas field on the 18th of March, and that was considered a significant escalation. And since that time, we've seen retaliation from Iran, which suggests that they're able to do significant damage to, and are threatening, in fact, to do significant damage to the region's energy infrastructure. They also struck Israel's nuclear facility in Dimona, perhaps not attempting to destroy it, but sending a signal to Tel Aviv that they're able to hit it. Of course, Trump later came out and said that he didn't authorize that at all, and that was just Israel acting on its own, and that Israel won't attack such facilities anymore. And that was after, of course, Tehran responded with 2 missile strikes in Qatar, and a promise of 5 more strikes on different facilities in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Trump, nonetheless, because we're sort of caught in this, situation where there's escalation occurring, and in that context, Trump threatened to destroy Iran's electrical power grid, which of course would be a war crime, as the war itself is a war crime. And that prompted Iran to promise significant damage, not only to the oil and gas infrastructure of the region, but also the desalination plants that countries like Saudi Arabia, but especially the UAE and others, depend on for a significant percentage of their drinking water. So despite the fact that it's not going well, I think we have to acknowledge that the U.S. and Israel, for that matter, do have an overwhelming technical military superiority, but that's not what's really winning this war. Iran is seeking to make the war as painful as possible before any sort of peace deal is reached. It may in fact be likely that Trump wants some sort of peace deal. Perhaps they did go in with the notion that this would be, 3 or 4 days or something like that. Of course, that's not turned out that way. But the point is that Iran is doesn't have a motive or a reason to agree to a ceasefire at this point. Twice now during diplomatic negotiations. So once last year in June during or right before Operation Midnight Hammer, and then of course immediately before the current war, Iran was engaged in negotiations with the U.S. So why would they then come back to the table? Why would they trust the U.S. If they promise to not attack them? They need to, from their perspective, impose so much hurt on the U.S. and perhaps even the global economy that when it is time to come back to the table, they'll be more assured that it's not simply a ruse to allow, say, Israel or the U.S. to build up their depleted and depleting stockpiles. Of course, key to Iran's defensive strategy is control of the Strait of Hormuz. We know about a fifth of the world's oil and natural gas, including LNG, liquefied natural gas, normally pass through the strait. Iran hasn't. I mean, if you know, in the media they talk about Iran shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. It's not shut down. There's a selective blockade going on. Iran has imposed a blockade on ships associated with enemy countries. It's allowed in ships with varying numbers from China, India, Pakistan, Turkey, Greece, Japan. I've heard of others as well. There's also reports that Iran is allowing ships to pass through the strait if the cargo in their holds is being traded in Chinese yuan. It appears that Marines and U.S. Marines and Rangers and others are on their way. Perhaps they're already there in the region. And there's been discussion of a ground invasion, which would be, of course, disastrous. And apparently most military analysts are saying that this is would be suicidal for given the geography for the U.S. To send in a significant ground force. We can't be sure of what they're planning, but again, they are sort of, trapped in this tit-for-tat escalation. So it's not out of the question. Something like that might, in fact, be required to retake the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, energy prices have continued to climb. I've seen one report, in fact, that Iran is actually making more money now during the war on oil sales than they were before, given how much the prices have gone up. And apparently their shipments have increased. Energy prices have gone up so much that the U.S. was forced to lift sanctions on Iranian oil that have been placed since 1979. So there are signs, and again, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen. It's possible it could end tomorrow, but it's looking like it's going to be dragging on. And if in fact the war drags on, there are several ways that it could expand beyond the region. Just yesterday or today, perhaps, depending on the time zone you're in, Yemen's Houthis, who are aligned with Iran, attacked Israel. There is an alternative route for Saudi oil to go through the Red Sea, so they could take it from the east and go west, but they either go up the Suez Canal or out the Bab al-Mandab Strait to the south, and the Houthis can potentially shut down that choke point the way Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz potentially. That would inflict more economic pain on not just the U.S., but of course the global economy. Should be noted that the day before the war on Iran started, Pakistan initiated a war on Afghanistan. Both countries border Iran, of course, to the east. To Iran's north, Azerbaijan has unfriendly relations with Tehran for the most part. There are about, well, at least 15 million, potentially quite more, Azeris living inside Iran. And that's potentially something that the US and Israel will try to manipulate in some way, if they haven't already. There was, in fact, a drone strike on Azerbaijan's Nakhchivan exclave on the 5th of March, which Baku blamed on Iran. Iran said that it was this was a false flag operation. They didn't say by who, but the suggestion is perhaps the Mossad or CIA to try to rile up their Azeri minority. There was talk about the U.S. trying to do the same with the Kurds in Iran. There's a significant Kurdish population in Iran, of course, and Iraqi and Turkish Kurdistan border Iran, and the Baluch region, of course, bordering both Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as another potential flashpoint. Most significantly, two of the world's three great powers, Russia and China, have friendly relations with Iran, and in fact, major investments in the region. The U.S. war on Iran is, of course, about securing the region. It's about getting rid of an obstacle, but ultimately, it is about weakening Russia and China. The Middle East, or West Asia, is a strategic region given its location and access to different regions, but also, of course, because of the energy resources. The U.S. empire is in rapid decline. It's been in decline for a long time. It had this moment after the Cold War, seeming the unipolar moment, that was always going to be temporary, and we really saw a rapid unwinding of things with the war on terror in the first decade of this century, which only further accelerated the U.S.'s decline. So I want to talk about that geopolitical dimension to Iran, because it really to the Iran war, because it's really central to understanding how things might play out, but also the consequences of the war in a possible, or eventually likely, I think, realignment of global relations. So let's start with China. China has become a key player in the global capitalist order. It, in terms of GDP, is second only to the US. It has about 1/6 of the world's GDP at $19.4 trillion in 2025. 28% of the world's manufacturing occurs in China, and that's more than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. Highly significant. And it's not simply cheap consumer products. China, along with the US, leads the world in the development and application of AI and robotics technologies. You might have seen those videos of the dancing robots, the New Year's celebration in China. That's an indication of how far they've come. China is the largest commodity exporter in the world. In 2024, they accounted for almost 15% of global exports. It's also become a major exporter of capital. So in 2025, the outward direct investment from China was $174 billion in US dollar terms. A large part of this is devoted to China's Belt and Road Initiative, involving massive infrastructure projects throughout Asia, but also in the Middle East and Africa as well. China has invested heavily in Middle East energy. Between 2019 and 2024, it was $89 billion of investments. It's highly significant. They have investments in Bahrain, so the 6 GCC countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It's hard to know how much they have in Iran itself because of the sanctions, and there's been kind of workarounds the Chinese have done. China has actually pledged to invest an astounding $400 billion in Iran over the next 20 years. Russia has emerged as another pole, another one of the three great powers of the global system. It's, of course, tied up with the war in Ukraine, which is a NATO proxy war against Russia, and which is, prompted Europe and other Western countries to impose more sanctions on Russia. This has led actually to a strengthening of ties between Russia and China. So before the war in 2021, China took in about 30% of Russia's crude oil exports, a lot. But today it takes in almost half, 48%. And significantly, most of those transactions take place using the yuan and the ruble. American imperialism wants to weaken Russia in order to open up fields for investment and to enhance its ability to project power in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And also, of course, to weaken China, given the close relationship between Russia and China. Before the Ukraine war began in 2022, Europe was heavily dependent on Russian energy and had been for decades, even going back to Soviet times. So in 2022, Europe depended on Russia for 45% of its natural gas and 27% of its oil. Given the sanctions, given the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline by the U.S., and just given the geopolitics of the situation, Europe has moved to massively reduce its reliance on Russian energy imports. But that's been uneven. And so certain countries like Hungary, for instance, still rely on Russia quite a bit. Also interesting, too, in the context of the current Iran war, the U.S. has had to ease sanctions on Russian energy exports to Europe, which has angered Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And even the most leaders of the EU reacted negatively to that. At the same time, they've done other things to increase their access to Russian energy. The ruling classes of Europe are divided over their orientation towards Russia. You have some elements of the far right parties which are growing that want to have friendly relations with Russia. They want to get the energy back and not have this military threat to their east. So things are in flux there, and it's not clear how it's going to work out. What is clear is that the Iran war, launched by the United States and Israel, has made a bad situation worse for Europe. Europe imports the vast majority of its oil and gas, and it saw natural gas prices rise by 2/3 in the first week of the war. There's also the possibility, depending on how things play out in the Middle East, that there could be a new so-called migrant crisis in Europe, in addition to the one from 10 years ago, prompted by these regime change wars in Syria in particular, but other countries in the region. And that, of course, would also likely to bolster the political fortunes of the far right. The European imperialists maintain a military presence in the region. There's been a lot of discussion of Britain's role in this, with the Royal Air Force bases being used by the U.S. to launch attacks on Iran. There are three bases, I believe, in Cyprus that Britain possesses. Trump requested assistance from Europe and even from China to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And he warned that it would be very bad for NATO if the Europeans didn't come to his rescue. Well, most of them didn't. Trump said, well, I don't need your help anyway. But of course, an admonished British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has now, pledged to help the U.S. more. Iran considers this to be direct participation in aggression by Britain. So whether Britain wants to be in the Iran war or not, and they still make noises to the effect that they don't want to be in, they are in the war. Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, in response to Trump's request for assistance to open the strait, said, quote, "This is not our war. We have not started it. What does Donald Trump expect from a handful of European frigates in the Strait of Hormuz that the mighty U.S. Navy cannot manage alone?" Unquote. It's a good question. France has made an unprecedented deployment of its naval power to the region. It has sent 8 warships, 2 helicopter carriers, and the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, with its 20 Rafale fighter jets. France has a permanent military base in the UAE at Abu Dhabi. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, at the beginning of the war, noted, quote, "France cannot approve of the strikes by Israel and the US on Iran because they were carried outside of the framework of international law." So that's a polite way of saying that the war is an illegal war. It is itself a war crime. Nonetheless, France and others have provided diplomatic cover for the US by essentially blaming the entire thing on Iran. France appears to be attempting to maintain its ties with the Gulf countries and secure an important military role for itself in the Middle East following the Iran war. There are different ways to interpret France and Britain, by the way, sending more military assets to the region. One is simply compliance with the U.S., but I think that there is this longer-term view, at least on the part of France, of looking beyond the current war and seeking to assure themselves a position within this important region. So note, for instance, that Spain, whose Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has condemned the war. Spain, along with Greece, the Netherlands, Italy, has sent their own frigates to the region as well. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and try to talk about what's going on in broader terms. So I mentioned that the U.S. empire is in decline, and that's really what this is about. This is about the U.S. trying to secure this region, especially against the other great powers, Russia and China. The Iran war is perhaps even more than the Ukraine war, the most significant stress test for NATO and what remains of the U.S.-led order. And it could become a catalyst for a realignment of imperialist relations. The Ukraine war is, of course, central to this rivalry or competition, as is the question of Taiwan and the South China Sea. Essentially, we are still in a situation where we have a U.S.-led imperialist bloc against Russian imperialism and against China and their bloc together. It would be foolish to predict with certainty what any kind of reconfiguration of the global system might end up being, but there is going to be some sort of reconfiguration. To think that things are going to remain the same, I think, is not realistic. The U.S. remains and will remain a major factor. It will have imperialist allies. That's not going to change. But what that looks like and what which countries it involves, very likely could change. The central geopolitical conflict really is between a declining U.S. and a rising China. Now, it's interesting, China doesn't play the role that the Soviet Union played in the post-World War II period. It's our view that China is not a capitalist state, but we have to acknowledge the gargantuan expansion of not only Chinese state-owned enterprises, but also Chinese capitalism as well. And of course, China is not imperialist. There's no capitalist state that Chinese finance capital is using to pursue its interests on the world stage. But China is growing, and the U.S. views it as a threat economically and militarily. The so-called middle imperialist powers, so like the other G7 countries, are militarizing. And that's a significant development. France is attempting quite openly to position itself as the dominant military force in Europe. It's very recently announced a new nuclear doctrine. It's increasing the number of nuclear warheads it possesses. It's not going to share that number as it has in the past. That will remain a secret. France has essentially will cast its nuclear umbrella across Europe. It wants to spread out its nuclear-capable fighter jets across the continent in several different countries. So it wants to play this leading security role in Europe. And that could take place. So right now it's being pitched as something that is in the framework of NATO and something that's being approved by the US, but it's not hard to see how this could set up Europe to play an independent role. Germany is in the midst of a massive remilitarization. What could go wrong? To become what it calls the, quote, strongest conventional army in Europe. Its total military budget for 2026 is 108 billion euros. European imperialists continue to be hostile to Russia, though a change to that relationship is not out of the question. There are powerful factors pulling Europe eastward, and particularly with China's rise. And also, it shouldn't be assumed that the Russia-China bloc is permanent. It's hard to know how things are going to shake out, but regardless, the very likely reconfiguration of the world system and the growing tensions that underlie it pose significant dangers for the world. Great power rivalry plunged us into 2 world wars in the last century and threatens to plunge us this time into a thermonuclear world war in this century. But there's another great power that we haven't talked about, the international working class. And the international working class, which is growing in number and strength, if not growing in political strength, has a material interest in overturning global capitalism. That is its historic mission. Our task as revolutionaries is to build the proletarian vanguard party that is essential to allowing the working class to carry out that historic mission. And we can talk in the discussion more about the politics of what that involves. I want to highlight one point that it can apply in many different domains, and that's the independence of the working class from the bourgeoisie. And I want to talk about that in relation to the policy that we should have towards this war and similar wars. And that's revolutionary defeatism. And this was most clearly articulated by Lenin during World War I. And essentially that means that for us, for communists living in imperialist countries, the lesser evil is the defeat of our own imperialist ruling class in the war. That doesn't mean we favor the victory of imperialist rivals to our own imperialist states. What it means is that we're in favor of revolutionary working class action against the war. And that very well could undermine the military position of our own imperialist states. So be it. The working class cannot allow itself to be drawn into the logic of inter-imperialist rivalry and war. Among many self-described communists today, imperialism simply means the American empire. And anti-imperialism has reduced itself to opposition to U.S. imperialism. That's a problem in the U.S., but it's especially a problem in other countries because it could lead to, or in fact will lead to, political adaptation to the ruling classes in other imperialist states. So, for instance, we're in favor of the destruction of NATO. We want to see it destroyed, but we don't promote the idea that Britain or France or Germany or Canada would be better off, would be more progressive outside of NATO and the U.S. orbit. China, as I said before, remains, in our view, a deformed worker state. We give no political support to the Stalinist bureaucracy. We don't portray their growing connections with the world as inherently progressive, although there is that side to it. China is not an imperialist country. And in fact, the collectivized property and state planning mechanisms that still exist and shape fundamentally Chinese society are profoundly progressive from an historical point of view. Our revolutionary defense of China against counter-revolution from without and within does not involve, and in fact precludes, support to any imperialist state that finds itself in an alliance with China, whether that be Russia or any other state in some future configuration. Imperialism in all its expressions is the biggest danger to China. We also defend colonial and neo-colonial countries from imperialist attack. Only in those cases where a neo-colony has subordinated itself to an imperialist power at war to become a proxy for that power do we withdraw our support. That is not the case for Iran today. That is the case for Ukraine in the Ukraine war. So we maintain our military defense of Iran. The question at the end comes down to revolutionary leadership, as Trotsky put it. And our goal is to work as a catalyst for the regroupment of hard communist elements throughout the world. And so I hope in our discussion we can touch on some of the main political points that are essential to that process. Thank you.